When Michael decides to come back, what was he, because, he only comes back for 17 games in the regular season. And he clearly wasn't the same guy wearing 45 until he famously switches to 23, which is an all-time moment. But what percentage of, like, peak Michael Jordan do you think he was when he's back after that year-and-a-half layoff?
When he came back for that shortened season, 75% best.
Yeah.
And it was a crazy thing. Even at 75%, he's probably better than 90% of the players, but he wasn't Michael Jordan.
Right. And would you say that's because of the muscle memory? I mean, obviously we all know that, like, basketball is one of those things where the shot and the touch around the rim matters so much in timing, but in terms of, like, the muscle mass, his body composition, was that a big hindrance when he came back for that shortened season?
It definitely was a hindrance. No question about it. No question about it. And I've told him that. I've told that story before too. There just wasn't enough time to make that transition. Not only from the body type, but also the skill set. It's not like going to play in a pickup game. You're literally coming back to play with the best players,
right,
and against the best players in the world. So I don't care how good you are, when you take a year and a half off, there is going to be a little slide, a little rust that needs to be worked off. And obviously with the results that he had gotten that shortened season, they didn't win the championship. The interesting part about that story is when they lost to Orlando, everybody was gone, and I was it was three of us sitting in the arena. It was myself, MJ, and one of his security guys. And he just sat there. He just didn't want to leave. And we were getting ready to leave. And I said, MJ, I just said, I'll see you. He goes, no, I'll see you tomorrow. So we literally started that next day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then one of the biggest blessings was that he had to shoot that movie Space Jam.
Right, in the dome.
Yes.
Yep.
So he was actually in one place for a very, very long time, and we were able to build a dome for him and get all the players to come compete against him at the highest level. So it's funny how those things all fell into place, and he came back, not just as good, if not better, than the previous years.
Mm-hmm. Did playing 36 or 54 holes of golf before a game conflict with any of your training methods?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? That's a great question. All right. So very rarely did he do 36. There were quite a few times that he did 18, and that was actually a part of his allowing his mind to relax. Golf was his getaway. We all have a getaway. We all need something. And Michael, he couldn't go to a restaurant and sit down. He couldn't go to a local bar and just say, I'm going to sit at the bar and have a beer or so forth, because there was always somebody either following him or watching him or wanting something from him. So the golf course gave him a place for solitude where he didn't have to be bothered, where there were no cameras. If there were cameras, there weren't as many cameras as there were before as now, or he allowed the cameras to come out there. So it allowed him, it was his reset. But he never took it to the point where it would be a hindrance to his performance. It actually enhanced his performance. And I have charts of all this. Before we had all this stuff, these analytics and so forth, I would actually chart how he played, the days he golfed before a game, the days he golfed after a game, practices and so forth, and see how he would perform at the game. And if there was an adverse effect, I would be the first one to point it out.
I'm gonna prop you up for a second for people who don't know. Tim Grover was MJ's Fitbit. He would literally watch how many steps he took in a basketball game and chart that. So when he says he chart, he would watch and rewind and count the actual steps, which is mind-blowing given today's technology that was what you had to do.
Yeah, well, back then, you know what? Most of your viewers are going to be too young to remember what a Betamax or VHS tape is, but that's what we had to do. You'd get the tape, and since I was at the games, you'd have to set the tape at the slowest speed so you could make sure you get all 6 hours of it. And then after the game, I would literally come home and I'd have to sit and I would literally watch the game, because that's how I determined what the workout was going to be the next day or the next week, or what was going on, because I needed to know how much activity he had going in one direction, how many activity he had explosive wise, how much activity he had stopping, jumping, landing, doing all that stuff. And and one of the things that you guys had mentioned earlier is there's this big thing about, in order to be successful, you have to create balance. You have to find somebody who's the opposite of you, just the opposite of you, that yin and the yang. I don't believe in that. All right. In order to be successful, the person that should be involved in your success has to be just as fucked up as you are.
Okay.
I like that. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You were talking about, charting his days that he would spend golfing, and then, correlating that to whether or not he had a better game or a worse game. Did you notice any pattern if he shot really well on the golf course that he would end up playing well that night, or maybe the opposite?
It was funny. He actually, the worse golf he played, the better basketball he played.
I was going to say, I wouldn't be surprised about that, because it gave him more motivation. He's like out to prove himself wrong.
Yeah, and usually when he was out there, he wasn't playing golf by himself. He was probably competing against somebody, and he was pissed off that he lost to him.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever beat him, he had to take it out on somebody. He had to take it out on somebody else, and whoever that was on the opponent's team, on the opposite team, they got the grunt of it.
Yeah.
I love that.
All right, I have a couple last questions. One is the famous Jeffries, maybe not famous, but Jared Jeffries story about the time that MJ flexed on Antoine Walker at your gym with the Ferraris and Lambos. Is that true? Can you tell us what exactly happened?
Yeah, so Antoine was a big car collector. He had a bunch of cars that and he'd like to come in and show them off all the time. So what happened was, Michael, obviously, he would get cars that weren't even up for sale yet. All right. So he just basically, one day he had a gentleman that took care of all his cars and everything. So he just had that guy and a bunch of people. He said, "Hey, I want you to just drive this, and this car down." And all of a sudden they were just, it was funny. They just surrounded Antoine's car. And just to say, "Yeah, Antoine, that's nice, but this is what I got." And then they would look at it. It was like, that's not even coming out for another year. Yeah, exactly. So by the time the cars that the cars that all the other players were showing off, those were like used cars for Michael, because he had already gotten those vehicles, because the companies wanted to see, they wanted to have Michael as a non-paid endorser in their vehicles.
Right. And all because Antoine Walker showed up with a nice car to your gym, and he was like, "Fuck that! I have nicer cars."
There was also a lot of shit talking going on in the gym too about it, and there was just his way of saying, "Hey, listen, this is my world. I'm letting you guys live in it and enjoy it for a little while."
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I've always wondered about, you always hear the stories going into the World Cup usually is when it pops up, but you hear about maybe a Brazilian soccer coach that takes his players away from their wives and girlfriends for a month leading up to the tournament, because if you have sex, you're a worse player. It takes like that edge off or whatever. In your experience, is there any correlation with that?
Well, you know what? I've charted a lot of things. That was the one thing I wasn't able to chart. All right, but I've known no correlation between it, what one way or the other. I have not seen it, but I have no that's a question. I know it's still prevalent in MMA and boxing and so forth. but there's no way for me, just from a scientific standpoint and from my research, I'm like, not everybody performs at the highest level when they're wound up. Sometimes other people perform better when they're unwound. And if that's your release, then so be it. You have to figure out what works for you. If you perform at a higher level, when you don't have sex, then don't have sex before. If you perform at a higher level, when you do, then do it. Those are things that me as a trainer cannot determine for you, and I cannot count those reps for those individuals.
How many strokes do you take the night before, Mike?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.